You might remember the days when there was talk about a Nintendo Ultra 64, but how about a Sega Ultra 64? The Nintendo 64 is a console that continues to receive nostalgic love, and for good reason. It is historically an important system that played a crucial role in shaping the transition from 2D sprites to fully realised 3D worlds. It was on this very platform that iconic franchises like Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda took their first ambitious steps into the realm of polygons, forever changing how we experience those series right up until this very day. Sure, other consoles had already dabbled in 3D before, however the N64 was where it truly became the standard, with the likes of Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time becoming truly pioneering. Yeah, the system's library was never the biggest, but some of its games were the most memorable. After all, the hardware was the birthplace of Paper Mario, Super Smash Bros. And the Animal Crossing franchise. On top of that, the console benefited massively from Rare's golden era, a period that saw the British developer producing some of the most beloved games of their generation: GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark, and Diddy Kong Racing, to name just a few. The Nintendo 64 undoubtedly has enough positives to ensure that it will never be forgotten. But what fewer people will be aware of is that, at one point, this very technology that would level up Nintendo was actually originally intended for a Sega console instead. That's right, before the Nintendo 64 became the world's most powerful gaming console, this cutting-edge technology nearly functioned as the beating heart of a completely different system, thus meaning if events had occurred ever so slightly differently, we could have lived in a world where Sonic, not Mario, would become the poster child for the leap into true 3D gaming. Imagine that. So, with that said, I am Lady Decade, and if you love that lesser discussed portion of gaming history, then hit that subscribe button, because this is the bizarre story of the Sega Ultra 64, a console that almost was. Let me take you back in time to a glorious era, the early 1990s. In this time period, the gaming hardware landscape looks very different from today, as the now fabled 16-bit console war is in full swing. Whether you lived through this or not, most of us know the classic story of Japanese juggernauts, Sega and Nintendo locking horns in a ferocious battle for dominance. And what began as a domestic struggle in Japan soon erupted into a global conflict, with the most crucial front line being the United States. Over there, Sega of America was waging war with their iconic aggressive marketing campaign, positioning the Mega Drive, or Genesis as it was known over there, as the cooler, edgier alternative to the family-friendly Nintendo hardware. This effort would, of course, work tremendously well, with Sonic the Hedgehog becoming a legitimate rival to Mario and the famous Genesis does what Nintendo slogan, hammering home the idea that Sega was the future of gaming. But what's just as interesting is that behind the scenes, both companies were already looking ahead. Well beyond this 16-bit battle, beyond sprite-based warfare, and towards the unconquered territory of 3D graphics. Some, and rightfully so, believed this to be the true future of gaming, and how right they were. Thanks to this paradigm shift in gaming, video games are now larger and more detailed than ever before, and what's even better is that you don't even always have to pay top prices for them. I, for one, can get you 44% off the new PC version of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, 28% off the newly released Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and even 24% off when pre-ordering Sega's very own upcoming Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii game, which I am very excited about. In fact, you can get huge money off thousands of games by taking advantage of my affiliate links. These are like real-life cheat codes, so why pay top dollar when you don't have to? Happy shopping, happy savings, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. Back in the early 90s, foreseeing this up-and-coming revolution was the CEO and president of Sega of America, the legendary Tom Kalinske, a man who understood the Western market in a way that Sega's Japanese leadership never quite seemed to be able to do at the time. So, with the next generation of consoles looming, Kalinske was already plotting Sega of America's next move. A move that at one point would have put them in direct partnership with the very technology that would later power the Nintendo 64. Gaming in the US has a unique history. You had the Pong console wars, the golden age of the arcade, the rise of Atari followed by the Atari crash. But the likes of Nintendo and later Sega would return gaming to prominence. As the medium shed its niche status and evolved into a booming industry, it inevitably began drawing interest from influential players beyond the traditional console market. One such player was Silicon Graphics Incorporated, a California-based firm founded by Jim Clark in 1981. While not a household name among gamers, SGI was a titan in the world of high-end computer graphics. Their cutting-edge workstations powered the breathtaking visuals in Hollywood's blockbusters, complex scientific simulations, and even military applications, domains where raw computational power was paramount. By this time, SGI had already revolutionized and taken the usage of 3D rendering technology to new heights, and they were planning on making high-end graphics viable for home gaming. After all, why limit themselves to the expensive industrial market when the booming video game industry was ripe for disruption? Determined to bring their technology into living rooms worldwide, SGI began courting potential partners among the console giants. Their initial target, Sega, the very company that was sweeping America and already illustrating through their marketing that they desired to be ahead of the curve, even though SGI believed they were also behind in some ways. CEO of SGI Ed McCracken was leading the company's push into the home console market. From his vantage point, Sega and Nintendo, in terms of graphics at least, were both lagging behind. By 1993, some Sega arcade cabinets had dabbled in rudimentary 3D, but for the most part, their home consoles remained entrenched in the flat world of 2D sprites. On the Nintendo side of things, games like Star Fox offered a glimpse of what was possible, but that technology was still in its infancy and incredibly crude in comparison to what was to come. McCracken, on the other hand, understood that 3D gaming wasn't just a future novelty, it was the industry's inevitable future. So, holding this opinion in mind, the idea was that if SGI could provide the hardware to fuel such an evolution, they could carve out a significant role in the gaming world. But this still raises the point that if it was this clear that 3D gaming was the direction that gaming was moving on going forward, then how had they not already found a partner to work with to bring 3D gaming into the home? The answer was simple: cost. While 3D gaming had been making strides in the high-end arcades and Hollywood CGI, the hardware required to render complex polygonal graphics was prohibitively expensive. No home console on the market had the power to run fully realised 3D environments without cutting serious corners, and even then, the cost of producing such a system would be astronomical. Ed McCracken theorised that for 3D polygonal gaming to become the norm in living rooms, SGI needed to develop a graphics chip that was drastically cheaper than anything currently available. The technology alone wasn't enough. Home consoles had to be affordable to the average consumer, or the whole venture would be dead on arrival. For example, we all know what happened to the ridiculously expensive 3DO, and that system featured a library of games that were not even as close to impressive as what could be found on the Nintendo 64. Providing console architecture which was as cheap as it was good was a challenge, but one that SGI was willing to take on. And so the company set out to design a cost-effective graphics processor that could finally make true 3D gaming viable for the mainstream market. But even with this goal in sight, they still needed to find a partner with a hardware manufacturer willing to take the risk. Despite the barriers that needed to be overcome, SGI set out to bring their technology into the living room. From here, McCracken set his engineers on a mission: create a graphics chip that was not only powerful but also energy efficient and, most importantly, affordable. And it wouldn't be long until his team achieved a breakthrough. After extensive research and development, they would make enough headway that they worked out that a decent chip could be produced ticking all the right boxes for just $40, a staggering 5 times cheaper than the existing high-end processors that they had produced previously. With this technological milestone in hand, Silicon Graphics Incorporated was no longer just a workstation manufacturer. They now found themselves in a position to reshape the future of home video gaming. In this new position, the company would quickly draw up plans for a next-generation console, one that could finally bring true 3D gaming into the home at a reasonable price. What an incredible leap forward! As for finding a partner, as already mentioned, there were only 2 logical choices: Nintendo and Sega, the industry's dominant forces. And at the time, SGI chose to rule Nintendo out. Madness, considering that indeed later SGI technology would power the Nintendo 64. The idea was that SGI believed that Nintendo's track record in gaming suggested that they wouldn't be interested in working with them. After all, Nintendo's conservative philosophy, which was exemplified by their low-cost, battery-efficient Game Boy, the sort of technology that wouldn't align with cutting-edge 3D graphics, even if they had found a way to make it cheaper than the norm. As for Nintendo's prior direction with limited tech, this was no accident. The Game Boy was the brainchild of Gunpei Yokoi, one of Nintendo's most influential designers who famously championed the philosophy of lateral thinking with withered technology. His approach was simple. Rather than chasing the latest, most expensive innovations, Nintendo preferred to repurpose mature technology that could be mass-produced cheaply and used in creative ways. With this in mind, SGI figured that Nintendo, a company that had built its empire on the cheapest and most cost-effective design, would be unlikely to invest in cutting-edge 3D graphics. Therefore, Sega, by contrast, had a bold, risk-taking reputation. To SGI, the choice seemed obvious. Sega was the company to bring its revolutionary graphics hardware to the home console market. Little did they know, things would not turn out as expected. Sega had already pushed technological boundaries with the Sega Mega CD, a CD-ROM-based add-on for the Mega Drive that featured an additional CPU and a custom graphics chip. While the add-on itself had mixed success, it demonstrated Sega's relentless pursuit of more powerful hardware. Pair this with Sega of America's famously aggressive marketing, boasting that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and it was clear that SGI's ambitions aligned more with Sega's bold ethos than Nintendo's conservative approach. Holding all of these thoughts and knowing that Tom Kalinske, Sega of America's leader, had a reputation for making big moves, if anyone in the industry would be open to radically shifting console technology, it was him. So therefore, SGI chose to approach him directly. According to Kalinske himself, he has commented on this in the past, stating, "We had just been contacted by Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics, who called us up one day and said that he had just bought a company called MIPS Incorporated. MIPS had been working on some things with some great R&D people, and it just so happened that they came up with a chip that they thought would be great for a video game console. We told them that in the US we don't really design consoles, we do the software, but it sounded interesting, so we decided to take a look at it." And so Sega of America did. Kalinske and his team were immediately impressed by SGI's technology. They instantly recognized that a console built around true 3D graphics had the potential to catapult Sega ahead of the competition in the next generation. Kalinske knew this tech had huge potential. Realizing the significance of this opportunity, Kalinske wasted no time reaching out to his Japanese superiors, urging them to send over their hardware team. As you know, in these old console war tales, the staff at Sega of Japan would often regularly dismiss ideas that came from America, but in this instance, the Japanese appeared interested. Sega of Japan agreed to take a look and dispatched a team led by their senior vice president of hardware. This was a pivotal moment. If the Japanese division approved of what SGI had to offer, Sega would have found themselves in a position to spearhead the 3D gaming revolution, providing us with an entirely different console landscape to the one we know today. But as history would prove, things didn't quite go according to plan. While Sega of America had been blown away by SGI's technology during the international visit, the Sega of Japan staff, also known as the ultimate buzzkill, remained stone-faced when shown the new tech, barely offering any feedback, appearing quite rude and reserved. It was as if they had already made up their minds before walking through the door. Then, after what must have felt like an eternity of awkward silence, the senior vice president of hardware finally gave his verdict. The chip was somewhat interesting, but they claimed it was too big for mass production. There were minor technical flaws that they disliked, and the audio and frame rates weren't up to the standard they deemed to be happy with. Sega of Japan officially shut the idea down in its current form, but despite this huge setback, SGI wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Instead of walking away and calling it quits on the spot, they told Sega they would address the criticism and repurpose the chip for their console specification. The results? SGI would quickly come back with an upgraded chipset that would supposedly address every issue that Sega had raised. With their revised technology in hand, SGI excitedly managed to secure a second review session, this time with Sega's chairman and CEO, Hayao Nakayama, in attendance. If anyone at Sega had the power to override the skepticism of the hardware team, it was him. So, would Nakayama recognize SGI's potential or shut down what could have been a game-changing partnership? Well, history already tells us the answer to this one. Nakayama would reject the tech. For Jim Clark, this was a crushing blow. SGI had spent years refining their chipset, believing they had addressed every one of Sega of Japan's concerns. Yet, even with Sega's chairman and CEO Hayao Nakayama in attendance, Sega's answer was a firm and final no. Deflated, Clark turned to Tom Kalinske, unsure of what to do next. SGI had created a powerful, affordable 3D graphics solution, specifically to Sega's specification at a huge cost, only to be dismissed by a company more focused on what seemed to be nitpicking than innovation. Kalinske, already at his wit's end with Sega of Japan's stubbornness, gave Clark a blunt but practical piece of advice. There are video game companies who would like your chip, just not Sega. And just like that, the future of 3D gaming took a completely different path. If Sega wouldn't embrace SGI's technology, then maybe, just maybe the company who SGI had initially overlooked perhaps would. So they took their rejected technology and pitched it to Nintendo. Ironically, the very company SGI had initially avoided, assuming it wouldn't embrace cutting-edge 3D graphics, was surprisingly very receptive to what they had to offer. In 1993, Nintendo met with SGI and, to Clark's surprise, they were immediately impressed. Nintendo recognized SGI's potential, but what impressed the shrewd company the most was the cost. While other companies experimenting with 3D gaming were looking at expensive hardware solutions, Sony was gearing up for the PlayStation, and Sega would later struggle with the costly Saturn, for example. SGI's graphics chip was both powerful and relatively cheap to manufacture. This sealed the deal. Nintendo were rubbing their hands together. This meant that on the 23rd of August of 1993, Nintendo and SGI signed an agreement to co-develop what was then called Project Reality, a system that would later become the Ultra 64 before officially being released as the Nintendo 64, resulting in a curious tale where Sega had played a part in assisting SGI in troubleshooting the very architecture that would be used for Nintendo's next-gen hardware. What a colossal miscalculation on Sega's part. Taking advantage of the SGI technology, Nintendo's N64 would end up selling 33 million units worldwide, dwarfing the Sega Saturn's measly 9 million. This serves as yet another example of Sega of Japan dismissing an opportunity that could have altered their fate, handing their biggest rival the technology that would define a generation. For Tom Kalinske, it must have been infuriating, as before rejecting SGI, Sega of Japan had also dismissed Sony's PlayStation partnership, forcing Sony to go solo and create a juggernaut that would ultimately crush Sega. Twice, Kalinske had seen the future, only to watch Sega of Japan throw it away. Instead of embracing cutting-edge 3D graphics and key partnerships, Sega doubled down on the Saturn, an expensive and, to some, cumbersome machine that alienated many developers. The results? Sega fell behind, and when they finally course-corrected with the Dreamcast, it was way too late. Don't forget, right now I can get you 44% off of the new PC version of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, 28% off the newly released Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and 24% off when pre-ordering Sega's upcoming Like a Dragon Pirates-themed Yakuza game set in Hawaii, which I'm particularly excited about. In fact, you can save a ton of money on thousands of games just by using my affiliate links. It's like having a real-life cheat code for discounts, or if you want to support my work in a more personal way, access my cosplay library and more over on Patreon, and I'll see you all again in the next video.